important for the oceans. Julie made the case why it's good for business, it's good for investors. And Andrea, don't spend that $100 anywhere. We paid her to put that in the top 5 of our wish list. So I'll dispense with trying to convince you why this is important. I'm Millicent Pitts. I'm the executive director of Ocean Exchange, which will surprise some people. I'm not going to talk about, but catch me at coffee, and I'll twist your arm to come to Ocean Exchange. This is a big topic. I call it the decarbonization, a big, hairy, audacious problem that we don't really know how to solve yet, notwithstanding electrifying some ferries, but moving goods across the Pacific Ocean or moving people across an ocean is quite a big deal. We don't know how to do it. We'll end up with a call to action, and that's going to be to ask all of you to collaborate. The industry needs collaboration. They need more science. They need the science that's been developed up to a certain point to be fully developed. They need partners for deployment. They need it to be financed. They need the social license for these new solutions to operate as well. It's going to take all of us to solve this. So I'm going to start off introducing our panelists, and then they're each going to talk about it from their perspectives. And I ask you to listen very carefully. One is going to talk about deep sea transportation, people and goods. It applies to both. The other will talk about short sea, and she'll even tell you what that means. They're equally complex and in some ways very different ways, and it shows how complicated the problem is because there's so many subsegments of this area, and it's not going to be easy. So let me start with Anshul Tuteja, and I'm going to, full disclosure, he's on the board of Ocean Exchange. So when I talk about how passionate he is about these topics, I know that very deeply. He is the Associate Vice President of Royal Caribbean Group. Everyone knows that. Leading cruise, one of the leading cruise companies in the world. 64 ships, they stop at over 1,000 worldwide destinations. He heads the global fleet optimization group that entails energy, assets, and program management. And Royal Caribbean has 5 different brands, so he cuts across all 5 brands. He is a marine engineer by training. He is an MBA, so he sees the science and the business element of this. After his MBA, he joined Maersk, which is one of the leading ocean liner companies in the world. And he did global stints in Singapore, Mumbai, and Copenhagen. And when he was at Maersk, he also worked on energy optimization. So he's deep into this. And thanks for being here. Jennifer States, who I'm meeting for the first time. She's been a little box on a computer screen for years, but it's so good to meet you in person. She was associated with the port and maritime industry for 10 years and 25 years in her total career with energy and clean tech. And she's been in nonprofits, government, and research environments, including Biennial. So I heard you work together. She is now the Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer for Blue Sky Maritime Coalition. That's a nonprofit, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more about what that's about. But it's a member-based group about getting to zero in terms of emissions. And before joining as a staff member there, she was on that board and worked as their volunteer government relations director. She was on the board, and she worked on various policy work streams. Previously, she was at Washington Maritime Blue, which is an incubator up in the state of Washington, DNV, Port of Los Angeles. We mentioned PNNL. And when she was at PNNL, it was DOE and Army assignments. So we welcome both of you. Anshul, let's start with you, and they're going to let me drive the computer while you talk.
All right.
Okay?
All right, sounds good.
Hold on a second here. Now what do I do? Hit. Yeah, you think that? No. No. Oh, no, that's next. Okay, here we go. Nope. Speaker one. Yes. And I can advance it with this. Okay.
Oh, you're going to run that?
You can do it.
Okay.
You can do it. Thanks.
All right. First and foremost, good morning, everyone. And Millie, thank you very much for the introduction. Well, first of all, what a beautiful and mesmerizing setting we are in today. I mean, like, and if you get bored with my talk or with my slides, you have a better alternative to look around. So my name is Anshul. As Millie mentioned, I'm the Associate Vice President at Royal Caribbean Group. And why we are here, because again, you know, oceans, healthy oceans and sustainable oceans are paramount to deliver great vacations to our guests responsibly and sustainability. And that's one of our key strategic imperative. I think I move with the green button. I won't go into this much. I think Millie mentioned already, but again, you know, again, ocean happens to be our bread and butter, and we have 5 critical, you know, missions or pillars, what we call it, for the ESG framework. And decarbonization is, or advancing our net zero emissions is one of the key lever in those 5 missions that we have. So what do we face as a challenge as an industry? Now, shipping, I know it's very visible, and especially cruising, we get a lot of bad press because when these big ships with 9,000 souls on board dock in the heart of the downtown, and you're all looking from the swanky skyscrapers, you believe the ships are bringing all sort of bad things to the local communities, with the smoke coming out, with the wastewater, with the garbage, and all those things. But again, shipping or cruising is the most sustainable way of vacationing, actually, per passenger. And so again, I think we are very visible, not just cruising, but the entire maritime. Cruising is a very niche sector of the maritime, you know, industry. There are roughly around 95,000 vessels sailing globally, and they made roughly 1 gigatons, which is roughly 3% of the total greenhouse gas emissions annually. So again, it's not a big number, but of course, if it's business as usual, very soon shipping would be around 10%, and hence we have to also play our part along with aviation. And now, of course, Europe is taking a lead. Shipping for the first time, along with aviation, would be part of the emission trading scheme, and hence now it kind of brings down to a question of right to operate in the near future. Again, Royal, I mean, like, we've been steadfast. We have committed to, you know, Seastainability, sometimes we refer to it as an organization, for the past 30 years. So this is not something new for us. Of course, there are a new set of challenges, but sustainability is deeply ingrained in our DNA. So of course, now, again, the world has to change and we have to change. So 5 years back, we announced the big and the baddest ship. It's called the Icon of the Seas. It's kind of going to debut next year. The world's largest cruise ship, almost 10,000 souls on board. And we came up with some new innovative ideas. Of course, at that point in time, 5 years back, when we envisioned this ship, LNG was or the natural gas, the methane was the most primary front runner as a transitionary fuel. Now, of course, LNG and natural gas is being debated, how clean, how green it is from a life cycle perspective. But I think certainly it's going to be a transitionary fuel as we look towards more further enhanced solutions. And of course, that's also a point of debate, what's going to be the future, in the sense that, you know, sometimes you have to look at the entire life cycle of the fuel to understand its sustainability aspects. Another industry first, we'll be launching this summer Silver Nova. She's going to be the first hybrid cruise ship in the world, powered by fuel cells and the battery pack along with LNG. So again, this just shows that you know, we are doing everything which is in our reach as of today from a technology and from fuel perspective that we can accomplish. But I think the biggest challenge that we also face is that we see IMO, which is the governing body of shipping, is a little bit slow in kind of acting and kind of setting up its all compliance and regulatory kind of things. And that is why we see Europe taking a kind of a head start, and that's what sometimes is referred to as the regionalization of regulation. And when regulations are running 10 steps ahead and the fuel and the technology and the markets are not aligned, that creates a lot of challenge. So again, there is no singular silver bullet that we can bank upon today, and that's why we're looking at multitude of different initiatives. Again, I mean, like some of the other initiatives we have taken up, we installed a wind farm in Kansas, roughly 76 gigawatt hours of energy per year. Again, this offsets roughly 15% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions, but then again, our intention is not to use them, but rather head towards a net zero target. So that means actually doing or putting all the efforts to reduce our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Very quickly, I mean, like, so these are our three main goals. Like, we were the first cruise line to embark upon the science-based targets last year. We're going to be launching a net zero ship, not just from a fuel perspective, but actually from a build perspective as well, which kind of includes all the material that goes into production of a ship. And then, of course, be net zero by 2050. So again, I think this picture kind of exemplifies our challenge. There was a time when a ship can just send a spec out to the bunker supplier and you can merrily sail into the port, get your bunker and merrily sail out. But I think the future is it's going to be varied. It's going to be a hybridization of energy sources that we're going to see. Of course, we are starting with the far right. These are some of the levers that we have identified for our decarbonization journey. Starting with energy efficiency, which of course is going to be our first fuel towards our transition. As I mentioned, there is no singular silver bullet with us. Data and digitalization is going to be key for decarbonization. Sometimes we refer to them as 3Ds. Future fuels, again, we believe that hydrogen will definitely be the molecule for the future fuels, the building block for the future fuels. And again, we'll have to look at the whole life cycle of these fuels before we kind of, make it as part of our operations. Of course, new technology, innovation, and I think Millie kind of covered it up in her opening statement that, collaboration is the key. As individuals, as company, we can't achieve what we have set ourselves to achieve, and it's a collaboration with not just the industry partners, but also academia and all the young innovators who are out there to kind of radically think and radically change shipping for the future. Shore power, of course, we are getting ready. The question is, how many ports around the world have that infrastructure for us to connect the plug to? Sometimes people ask me, why don't you just get into the port of Miami and plug your ship? But the question is, on any given typical day, you can have 5 ships calling Port of Miami, and if you try to plug in, well, of course, Miami doesn't have shore power right now, but they intend to have it. It's going to suck out the entire power of the state of Florida. So that's the kind of power demand these cruise ships have. But of course, certainly we are investing and we are expecting that the port and the other government institutions will also kind of ramp up. Green corridors, something which is new and brewing up. I think it's going to establish new fuels for the future ships. And then finally, carbon capture, which again is a very intensive, energy intensive process. And the question is, where do we also store this carbon on board? Because roughly 1 ton of fuel that we burn on board, it generates approximately 3 tons of carbon. So the question comes in, where are we going to store it and how are we going to discharge it and who's going to use it? So I think it will take some time. Well, anyways, that's just the opening talk. Over to you, Jennifer. Thank you.
We'll see if this works. Next presentation. All right, it worked for once. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate being here today and seeing some familiar faces that I used to work with. And Jennifer States, Blue Sky Maritime Coalition. So the maritime sector, as has been mentioned by a couple of speakers, is really experiencing a technological revolution that will need to meet maturity in less than 3 decades. This is less than the lifespan of a typical U.S. ship. Thousands of zero-emission ships are required to be in the water by 2030 to meet our 2050 net zero ambitions globally. This necessitates a complete transformation of the dominant fossil fuel technology and a major scaling up of finance for new technology development. In addition, we're going to need regulatory policies and effective public-private alliances. As they've mentioned, collaboration is key. And this is the backdrop of why I'm here today. Okay, the upper green button.
Blue Sky Maritime Coalition is a strategic alliance formed to accelerate the transition of waterborne transportation in Canada and the US towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions. The maritime sector is well behind the grid-connected energy sector in its decarbonization pathway, and the US is even further behind the global maritime sector. That's the reason we focus on US and Canada waterborne transportation. The coalition brings together stakeholders across the waterborne transportation value chain to collaborate on projects that remove barriers to accelerating development, to encourage innovation and the necessary investments for uptake, and also to promote policies in support of net zero emission pathways. Our objective is to support significant near-term reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and accelerate the industry towards commercially viable net zero emissions. A key priority is to encourage innovation and investments in vessels, infrastructure, digitalization, and align pilot projects that will achieve this objective. This final one is a critical step for a successful energy transition and in order to secure production at scale, achieve uptake, and safe implementation of low, zero carbon marine fuels. Millie asked me to say a little bit more about the U.S. marine transportation system and a bit more about the difference between short sea and deep sea. It's pretty simple. Short sea is the shorter voyages, whereas deep sea are the over longer term ocean going voyages of both goods and people. But in the U.S., the waterborne transportation system is made up of U.S. flagged ships that ply the inland, Great Lakes, and coastal areas, and U.S. flags, Coastwise, and Jones Act that are engaged in international trade. This includes national security as well as our sea lift capability, as well as foreign flag vessels that are calling on our U.S. ports. As you can see in the pie chart, the inland, Gulf, and intercoastal waterways really dominate our U.S. waterborne transportation sector, with coastal and Great Lakes having another portion. Passenger transportation includes 115 million and 30 million vehicles annually. Our inland waterways carry a lot of freight, worth more than 134 billion. And our coastal transportation carries vital commodities such as agricultural products that feed our economy, as well as the global linkage through our harbor services. And Great Lakes, also a supply chain for our industrial heartland. Blue Sky Maritime Coalition recently put together some insights on carbon dioxide. So we tried to look across the entire US and Canada waterborne transportation sector and get some numbers around our emissions. Well, it turns out this is much harder to do than one would think. This data hasn't been gathered previously in the same way. There's no measurement requirements. There's no consistency in the formulas for calculating it. And actually, as we looked across all of the different studies, there's not a number that's even close in the range of what we've found. But what we came up with is that it's about 1% of total North American emissions. But really the key finding is that there is no consistency. We really need measurement data in order to understand the baseline. Well, waterborne transportation is the most environmentally friendly way to transport goods and people. With barge as an example, to move an identical amount of cargo by rail generates 43% more carbon dioxide, and by truck, over 800% more emissions. So it is more efficient, but ports are a transportation nexus for vessels, truck, and rail in one location. Port communities are typically the oldest part of our communities and historically have been used for industrial purposes. 12% of our population lives near seaports, and many seaport communities are considered environmental justice communities. We see that within 25 miles of ports, we have higher rates of respiratory and cardiovascular disease, in part due to these elevated emissions. And we see higher hospital visits among residents, 2.9 times more likely to be a person of color than white near our port communities. So a critical issue when we're looking at the impact of decarbonization. All solutions require value chain alignment and collaboration. Vessels, as has been mentioned, have a lifespan of 20 to 35 years for international shipping, but up to 50 years and sometimes even up to 80 years for our US domestic fleet, which means investments in vessels today will have a huge impact on our ability to decarbonize the sector going forward. We will need to consider retrofits for much of the US fleet. New ships should be designed for dual fuel or conversion to zero emission fuels in the future to avoid sunk cost. But unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to meet the energy density requirements of the industry. Vessels tend to be bespoke, very unique designs, even in the same class or category of vessels. Public and corporate investments in research and demonstration, and especially deployment and demonstration for zero carbon fuel technologies needs to be ramped up. The maritime industry has estimated that $5 billion is needed to advance these alternative technologies towards pre-commercial development. In addition, we need bunkering infrastructure and efforts to establish the entire fuel supply chain, fuel production, transport, distribution, and storage. We're currently facing longer lead times for traditional supply chain, let alone the new energy technologies such as electrolyzers for hydrogen generation, where we're also seeing shortages. We have major shortages in traditional maritime jobs, plus the new experiences that are going to be needed. Training programs must be established to expand and the technical skill sets of the current workforce and recruit and educate new generations of maritime professionals. But there are many opportunities as we move forward in uptaking these new technologies. The projects identified do take between 1 to 6 years to reach maturity, and regulatory pathways for new technology on ship also takes time. So action and investments are required now if we're going to deliver these significant number of zero-emission ships by 2030. At the same time, uptake of digitalization across the maritime sector to optimize ship voyages, cargo operations, and port activities is critical to meet global decarbonization targets and regional ambition levels. The industry is going to need policies that maximize the impact of first mover projects and support broader value chain collaboration initiatives, such as the green shipping corridors, as Anshul mentioned, and that we're deeply engaged in. And then global and regional policy frameworks need to be further aligned and to help scale up the technology, fuels, and decarbonization solutions. So, call to action. We need you. We need your innovation, your policies, your financial resources. We need to bring together our public and private financial resources to do pilot projects and help move things forward. Here's a few examples of projects here and new startup companies that are working in this space. Amegy, one of our members that has an ammonia to fuel cell solution that's working towards shipping, has demonstrated this for tractors and trucks so far and just bought a tug. And actually need to update that. They now have a $139 billion additional fundraise that they just got for Series B1 financing. Gloston is working on a new California coastal hybrid hydrogen research vessel for UC San Diego Scripps. And I just heard from Office of Navy Research that they're putting some funding into that to make it a test platform so we can collaborate on uptake of these new technologies. The first hydrogen fuel cell ferry built in the United States was built in Bellingham, Washington by All American Marine, and that's pictured in the bottom left corner. And there's a hydrogen zero emission tug team being led by Crowley in California that's working to move forward with that, as well as their E-Wolf, which is already their electric vessel that is working to be deployed very soon. So with that, thank you.
We have time for a few questions. I really can't see. I hope someone can wrangle the questions for us. Okay, come up to a mic. Surely someone is going to ask the question, what are green corridors? And right? Okay, I will.
A question if you want.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
This mic on?
Yes.
Great.
We
Ken
hear you.
Whistler with Oceanographic. Maybe this is to the gentleman from the Royal Caribbean, but in oceanography, we talk about ships of opportunity that are often used. So have you been approached or thought about deployment of marine CDR technology approaches, say, from your ships? I'm thinking of deployment of minerals for alkalinity addition, nutrients to enhance productivity. So are you in discussion in any way with the communities that are trying to put things in the ocean to perhaps enhance CO2 uptake?
Well, the answer is no. I mean, like the only thing that we have been approached for so far is for the weather data collection. So we have running some joint projects with NOAA to kind of pick up some of the Gulf currents and other weather patterns locally within the oceans, but nothing beyond that.
We should talk.
And I'll mention, I know we have some members that are working on some demonstrations for carbon capture on vessel, but just getting measurements is kind of where the industry's at, of just starting to try to get to the point of even doing direct measurement of carbon dioxide on vessels. But I am aware of at least one demo that's working on capture on a vessel.
Okay, we have someone else? No? You're coming to the...
Hi.
There we go.
I have a twofold question. One is how much ship routing that you didn't mention could be used, at least in a transition phase, to facilitate mitigation? And the second part of the question is about open data from maritime sector. How much, because from the research community, there is a lack of data on how much the ships consume, and how much you think this can be a future step to also make a stronger collaboration.
I briefly mentioned like digitalization and smart ports, that is a key part of the technology solutions that we're trying to move forward. But maritime sector is definitely behind in terms of uptake of those digital technologies. A lot of our ports still use, whiteboards or paper for tracking of vessels and optimization. But as we move forward, smart ports and optimization of slow steaming and just-in-time arrivals and those types of things can have a significant impact on emission reduction. I've seen numbers like 15% reductions in what can be accomplished. But it is a matter of getting the vessels and the ports both to move forward with uptake of these new technologies. And there really isn't a lot of government funding support to help make that happen. So it is a bit of a struggle. I know that there's some new companies like IO Currents and others that are really getting good at onboard vessel optimization by taking ship measurements on how things are happening with the vessels, and even being able to do predictive maintenance through that data. But getting to that smart port piece, we do see it globally. I think Singapore and some others have some really innovative digital technologies that have moved forward on that front. And I can't remember the second part of the question now. There was digital tech and... Oh, open data. Yeah, open data. So maybe you can talk to this on the global perspective, but there are different requirements about CO2 emissions reporting. So just talking about the emissions side of the data, there are more and more global requirements around that, the CII and the European platforms, where you're required to report your calculated emissions, but the US and Canada don't have anything like that. And so trying to get the maritime sector to share that data voluntarily has been a little challenging. Some consider that data proprietary. We're starting to have conversations about how you could have a collective database where that data can be anonymized, or at least getting the overall numbers. But whether that's going to happen, through a government agency or through, a nonprofit like ours trying to put something together, we're starting those discussions and really try to figure out how we can have those data sharing platforms and move forward in that regard.
Well, just to briefly dovetail you, like weather route optimization is one of the key things, and we often see we have captains who have sailed the global oceans for 30 plus years, and they've kind of stuck with a certain sort of route forever. And I think now with data, with predictive AI and machine learning, and with the kind of great route library that we have created, we are able to kind of give that predictive route notification to our captains, and of course then in real time optimize as the weather changes along the length. And then again, open source data is again very important in the sense that all the decarbonization efforts that we are putting together, there are so many vendors who are on our ships who generate this data, and if you don't have that all consolidated on a singular platform and again anonymized, then it becomes very difficult to achieve any significant and meaningful reduction in our emissions and reporting as well, and thereafter compliance.
Okay, I'm going to ask my, oh no, we have another question. Go ahead. I have my burning question, but I'll wait.
Thanks, I appreciate you sparing a little bit of time. I'm Mike Conathan with the Aspen Institute and the Sustainable Ocean Alliance. And I had a question for Jennifer, sort of for the policy-minded folks in the room, because that's where I come to these issues from. Specifically, loving the opportunity and the decarbonization that comes along with growth in short sea shipping, particularly in the United States. But the obstacle there, of course, being the Jones Act that requires vessels trafficking between two American ports to be US built and US crewed. Do you have any thoughts about what that obstacle represents and potentially how to overcome it?
Well, I mean, I'd say for a lot of the new vessel uptake that I'm seeing happen in the United States, we do have shipyards and technical capability to build those. So, for example, the Sea Change built in Bellingham, an all-American Marine, it was the first hydrogen ferry, built in the world. I believe in Norway they just finally launched the big passenger ferry that's also hydrogen. But we're seeing, and then Washington State Ferries is moving forward with electrifying their entire fleet, and the RFP for that just went forward, and they're planning to build that in Washington State. So we do have the shipyard capabilities and technical expertise, I think, in some way to even leapfrog around some of the hydrogen technologies. And so I see it for the short sea, that's a good opportunity for us. The bigger challenge is where you see with offshore wind vessels and what's required for, on the East Coast, jack-up barges and large-scale vessels. You're starting to see some collaborations form so that you can get them built in the US, but the problem is to build a vessel of that size, you have to have a lot of players coming together to utilize that, and that's really challenging with a new emerging market, not knowing the timelines on the regulatory pathways and everything else. So I did see there's some US policy to help with the tax credit for offshore wind vessels, and so we're starting to see a little bit of support there, but the gap in the cost of these technologies really does need more US policy for encouraging that uptake. The few grants I have seen that have come out of the new Infrastructure Investment Act and bill aren't vessel specific, and when they are, they don't quite get the language right on what actually works for the industry, saying things like purchase commercial off the shelf technology that's zero emission. Well, that doesn't exist yet. This is off the shelf. So there's a lot of challenges where it needs to be addressed, but I think the key is that we need to collaborate to figure out how to move those forward, and we need more policy to really bridge that financial and risk gap that exists to move it forward. So yeah.
Oh, sorry, Manu, can we have a question from the Zoom? Okay, remote participants have a question. Neither of the panelists mentioned wind power. Although it could be difficult to go entirely wind powered, what is the potential for increasing fuel efficiency with the help of wind foils?
Well, so there's a couple different technologies I've seen for adding wind propulsion power. One is, I think it's called a fretnal rotor, which I don't know if you've looked at this more specifically, but yeah, adding fretnal rotors that can actually create power for the propulsion system. I think there's an offshore wind blade delivery vessel that is going forward as a zero emission vessel using these. And there's even a wind ship association that's working to help advance these technologies. And then the other one I've seen is like cargo ships where they actually deploy a large sail in front to really help pull them along and get some of those efficiency gains. But I don't know the specific percents or technology readiness level of some of these technologies. I don't know if you guys have looked into it more.
No, certainly the flattener rotors, the big challenge, of course, there are companies who actually deployed those on their ships. Maersk Tankers was one of the pioneers in that. The challenge is that the ship needs to be on a certain route, like on a liner service for a very long time, because the wind has to hit the beam of the vessel in order for you to kind of get the assistance from the wind. If it's coming from the front, then it kind of actually adds drag, which kind of then adds to more fuel consumption. So again, it has to be a hybrid approach. Of course, what you mentioned, Jennifer, we also have these kite sails, but then again, the ship has to be on a certain route, and the modelers have to understand the wind patterns and model that for the entire year. Otherwise, if you don't have if you don't have an engine, if you're just being propelled by the wind alone, then I think you don't have an operating ship for the entire year.
I want to add something. The Windship Association, the fellow that runs it, Gavin, I can't remember his last name, but if you're interested, I'll put you in contact. But one of our sponsors of Ocean Exchange, board member Willenius Wilhelmsen, they have modeled and are going to go into construction. You can Google the Ocean Bird, the Orcel, Willenius Wilhelmsen. They've gotten EU money to do this. So some are moving forward to try to see where this really goes. Manu, did you have a question? You're okay?
Since at the beginning of the session, we talked a lot about collaborations, and for the cruise industry, I think another potentially really valuable asset is all the souls that are on board of the ships that you were talking about. And I'm sure you probably have programs, science programs that go. I was wondering if this is also an opportunity to create programs that are really introducing people to the solution space of the ocean, also the challenges that we're facing with decarbonization, because you never know, among all those people, there will be bright talents that could come to the rescue, or at least raise educational awareness.
I think certainly a good idea, and we of course run a lot of programs on our ships, educating our guests. We actually have a couple of days in a sailing, depending on the length of the sail, where captains and chief engineers actually spend time with the guests. And guests have some very interesting questions for us, like, for example, nuclear. I'm like, when are we going to see nuclear on a cruise ship? But then often when we ask the question back to the guests that, are you ready to sail on a nuclear powered cruise ship? And they said no. So it's a kind of a chicken and egg situation. But then again, I mean, like, it also varies with the demographics. I mean, like, what we have seen is, you know, primarily in Europe, people are much more aware. People want to kind of, you know, do much more about those things. And sometimes, you know, with demographics, we'd see a difference of awareness and so on and so forth. So we run those programs accordingly.
And there is internationally an organization, I think they're called Peace Boat, and they're trying to build an eco ship. And I got to go speak on their original vessel, which is an old retrofitted vessel. But that's exactly what they're doing. They're bringing together communities that are really interested in environmental and sustainability, and traveling the world and having lectures at those different communities about things that can come together on that front. And on nuclear, I'm starting to see a lot of new technologies emerge. The regulatory uptake side is going to be the more tricky part, but Core Power was just at the conference I was at last week and has technology for vessel propulsion. And then we're also seeing, you know, on the shore side, the amount of renewable or green energy that we're going to need to make these e-fuels of the future. I mean, we're talking more than gigawatts. I think I saw Maersk demand for their vessels that are going to come to the Gulf. They're planning to install 2 gigawatts of dedicated wind and solar to make the e-fuel, the green methanol for that. So that's just one stop for, I think, 3 or 6 vessels that are going to go to the Gulf there. So we're going to need some additional gigawatts of clean generation on the shore side as well. So we're starting to see some projects move forward in the Pacific Northwest on that front.
We've seen an energy storage device that has a nuclear basis to it for shore power. So ships burn a lot of fuel while they're in port, right? They have a lot of work to do, loading, unloading. You can imagine cruise ship. So the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, right? If you can capture it and store it. So we've seen nuclear ideas there. So we have 1 more minute. Maybe they'll give us 2. Jennifer, pretend we're sitting on the airplane together, and in 120 seconds, tell them what green corridors are.
So green corridors, or sometimes called green shipping corridors, is a way to bring together a collaboration that is essentially of a port-to-port or a multi-port, all the stakeholders engaged in that aspect. So there is a green corridor for cruise, the Pacific Northwest to Alaska, green corridor for cruise that's being led by Port of Seattle, but Royal Caribbean and all of the cruise entities that ply between Canada, Alaska, and Seattle area are all part of that effort. And we're a member that's helping to provide knowledge partnership. We're leading a green corridor effort in the Gulf that's trying to bring together, going up the inland waterway, and we kicked off and are leading that effort. And the Great Lakes is now also just kicking off this week, going to have an in-person meeting to kick off an effort around green corridors. The idea is you bring them together, you find ways to collaborate and help move forward on those demonstration projects, but they typically start with the convening, a charter, feasibility study, and then helping to move forward on some of that low-hanging fruit of what you can do more collaboratively.
I heard a webcast of Jennifer's organization 2 weeks ago. David Walker of ABS, American Bureau of Shipping, talked to Jennifer, get a link to that. I thought it was the best. Of course, it was more than an airplane conversation, if you're curious about it, because it is something for the future. So thank you both. This has been just great. Give them a hand, please. Thanks. Good questions. We have a 20-minute break coming up. Following the break at 11:30, there are CDR quick talks and a CDR poster session. And track 1 sessions then resume at 12 p.m. Thank you all.